Story time, it's my favorite time, spending time reading with you. Welcome to another story time with GamGam. Let's see what we have for today.
Welcome back to Story Time with GamGam, and today I want to read you one of the stories from Winnie the Pooh's Bedtime Stories. There's a number of stories in here, so I am really looking forward to sharing them with all of you. They were one of my youngest son's favorite stories. Our first story is In Search of Breakfast. It was the very best time of day in the 100-acre woods, which is the same as saying it was the very beginning of the day, when the sun was just easing itself up over the horizon. It was the time when a certain bear of very little brain typically rolled out of bed to celebrate the new morning with a very large breakfast. But this wasn't to be a typical morning at Winnie the Pooh's house. Instead of the friendly rattle of honeypots and hungry smacking noises, the only sound to be heard was a long shivering sigh, followed immediately by a most forlorn, "Oh, bother." Pooh was sitting on the edge of his bed, swinging his feet aimlessly and looking terribly sad. He looked as if not even the thought of breakfast would cheer him up. In fact, when the thought of his favorite time of day for a small smackerel of something sweet to eat did occur to him, he wrinkled up his forehead even more and swung his feet around a bit more nervously and said very loudly, "Oh, bother, bother." Some serious thinking had to be done about breakfast, and Pooh knew there wasn't enough room inside for it to take place properly. So he hopped off the bed and began to dress as quickly as he could. In no time at all, Pooh was stomping through the 100-acre woods in no particular direction as fast as his short legs could carry him. Realizing finally that thinking was done much more constructively when seated comfortably than at a full run and all out of breath, Pooh plopped himself down on a convenient stump and tried to look as serious as it was possible for him to look for as long as it was possible for him to do so. He managed this for up to several seconds at a time, hoping that the more he looked as if he were having an idea, the more likely it would be that one might come along. He reacted with dismay at the uncharacteristic look of concentration on Pooh's face. "Pooh boy!" Tigger cried with great concern in his voice. "What's the matter? Thorn in your paw? Ache in your tooth? Cramp in your cramper?" Pooh tried desperately to hang on to his serious expression as he answered, "No, Tigger, it's nothing like that. Why do you ask?" "I'm asking 'cause you look like you just lost your best friend," Tigger said. "And I know that's impossible, 'cause I'm standing right next to you the next time I looked." Pooh smiled. "You were standing there the last time I looked, too," he said. Then he sighed as he realized that all his efforts at thoughtfulness had disappeared along with his frown. "Then what are we waiting for?" shouted Tigger with delight. "It's time for breakfast. Let's go do what Pooh Bears and Tiggers do best, and snarf down a few smackerels." "I can't," said Pooh, so very quietly that Tigger almost didn't hear him. "Winnie the Pooh can't have breakfast?" Tigger responded in amazement. "Why not?" "Because breakfast is what is eaten after a night's sleep," Pooh explained sadly, "and I haven't had the sleep yet." "I think you'd better tell me what's going on, Pooh," said Tigger solemnly. "Well," Pooh began, thinking back, "it was a soft and cozy night. My bed was quite comfortable, and I'd just had my midnight smackerel, so there was no rumbly in my tumbly to keep me awake." "So what happened?" Tigger wanted to know. "Did some sort of noisy type noise keep you awake? Creaking faucets or dripping floors?" "No," replied Pooh thoughtfully. "It was the quiet. I listened to it all night long. There seemed to be so very much of it." "Wow," said Tiger. "I don't think I have ever even heard my bedtime story if all that quiet was hanging around me." "Bedtime story," said Pooh, suddenly sitting up very straight. "I didn't hear any bedtime story." "Hoo, hoo, hoo!" exclaimed Tigger triumphantly. "No wonder you stayed awake. How can anyone go to sleep without a bedtime story?" "You're right, Tigger," said Pooh, laughing with relief. Then all at once the smile faded from his face. "Does that mean I have to wait until bedtime tonight for a story before I can fall asleep and have today's breakfast tomorrow?" Pooh didn't want to think about being behind at breakfast every morning from that day on. Then he realized that if he couldn't have today's breakfast until tomorrow, today's lunch and dinner would have to be put off as well. The thought was almost more than his hungry tummy could stand. "Ah," Tigger assured him, "a bedtime story is good any time you go to bed. So that must mean breakfast is good any time you wake up." Pooh nodded understandingly. "Now all I have to do is find one so I can have the other." Tigger threw his arm affectionately around Pooh's shoulder. "Relax, Pooh boy," he told him. "I've got a doozy of a story for you." Once upon a bounce. It was a typical Tuesday morning for Tigger. He bounced out of bed, bounced through his bath, splashing water everywhere in the process, bounced out his front door, and hurled himself across the 100-acre woods in a series of leaps and bounds that carried him easily over even the tallest trees until he arrived at the home of Winnie the Pooh. As soon as Pooh opened his front door, before he could say so much as "Good morning, Tigger," or "My, aren't you looking particularly well today?" Tigger threw his arms around the portly bear, and they rolled head over heels across the floor into Pooh's parlor. "Hiya, buddy bear!" shouted Tigger happily as he pinched Pooh's round cheeks enthusiastically. "Are you as happy to see me as I am to be seen?" "Hello, Tigger," Pooh answered. "I'm always glad to see you." He rubbed his face tenderly. "I'm even glad to feel you most of the time." "So what's for breakfast?" Tigger bounced into a chair, rattling the honey pots spread out on Pooh's dining table. "It's Tuesday, you know." "Is it really?" responded Pooh politely. "And what exactly has Tuesday to do with me, you, and me, and breakfast?" "Well, Tuesday's the day after Wednesday," said Tigger with surprise. "It's the day I always come for breakfast." He tied a napkin elegantly around his neck. "One can't, after all, eat breakfast all by oneself when it's," Tigger pointed a finger at Pooh Bear, "one," then at himself, "Tuesday, can you?" He wagged his eyebrows in delight and chortled, "Ho, ho, ho, ho!" Pooh was well aware that arguing about numbers only made him hungry, and he was hungry enough already. "No, two can't, I suppose." He climbed onto the chair next to Tigger. "Oh boy," said Tigger, grabbing a pot of honey and pouring a more than large dollop of the sticky, sweet liquid down his throat. "I love this stuff," he mumbled when he stopped eating long enough to lick his lips. "Me too," said Pooh quietly, watching Tigger put down the now empty pot and snatch up a full one. Pooh had much preferred the days when Tigger had thought he didn't like honey. It had meant much larger portions for Pooh. "You know," said Tigger, after emptying his third or fourth pot of honey, "I bet you love honey as much as I love bouncing." "Yes," Pooh sighed as he gazed at the growing pile of very empty pots. "And it always seems there's never enough of what we love the most." Tigger stopped right in the middle of a particularly messy slurp, unaware of the honey leaking down over his nose. He gazed forlornly at Pooh. Not enough of what we love the most?" Pooh, his face poked deep into a distress in the empty jar, replied hollowly, "It seems so. Good things sometimes just seem to run out." Climbing slowly and carefully down from the chair, Tigger stood, flat-footed and awkward on the wooden floor. "Thanks for the breakfast, Pooh," he said, "but I think I'll skip the rest of it. I'm not very hungry all of a sudden." Then, sliding his feet cautiously across the floor, Tigger walked slowly out of Pooh's house. Pooh's face, squinched into a puzzled frown, watched him go. He then surveyed the jumble of empty pots, crocks, and jugs scattered on his table. "Goodness," Pooh mumbled to himself, "what would I have done if he'd been hungry?" For the next few days, the primary topic of conversation at the 100-acre woods was, "What in the world is the matter with Tigger?" "It takes him forever to get from one place to another," Rabbit observed. "When he bothers to go anywhere," whistled Gopher. "He seems so sad," said Piglet. "He just sits around and mopes." "And if you don't mind me saying so," Eeyore added, "Tigger's no slouch when it comes to moping." So, demanded Rabbit, what are we going to do about him, Pooh? Pooh scratched his head and considered for as long as he thought was polite. Then he said, I give up. What? No one makes the friend feel better than you do, Pooh, said Piglet, taking Pooh's hand in his own. That's right, agreed Eeyore. Just find Tigger and do what you always do. Oh, well, said Pooh, I suppose I could do that. Of course you can, Pooh, said Rabbit, patting him on the back. That's why we're sending you. As Pooh wandered through the 100-acre wood looking for Tigger, he was thinking furiously, hoping he could remember what it was he always did. So deep in thought was Winnie the Pooh that he almost stumbled over Tigger, who was sprawled on a riverbank, staring gloomily at his reflection in the water, totally unaware of what was going on around him. Pooh was so surprised to see him that he didn't have time to think about doing what he always did. He simply did it, blurting out a delightful to see you, Hello, Tigger! Yow! Startled Tigger, bouncing several feet into the air, landing on his feet. Tigger threw his arms around Pooh and rested his head on Pooh's shoulder. Please, Pooh boy, he gasped breathlessly, don't ever do that again. Certainly, Tigger, agreed Pooh, but could you please tell me exactly what it is you don't want me to do? He pulled thoughtfully on his ear. I hope it's not what I always do, whatever that is. Just don't make me bounce like that, said Tigger. I haven't got that many left to waste, you know. You haven't? Asked Pooh, very much surprised at this news. How many bounces did you have to begin with? Well, said Tigger thoughtfully, I always figured it was one of those great big numbers that could come somewhere after 2. He leaned close to Pooh and continued in a whisper, but somebody told me once, I disremember who exactly, that good things just seem to run out sometimes. Pooh rubbed his ear thoughtfully. I heard someone say that once too, he mused, but I can't remember who it was either, so it must not be very important. Pooh crinkled his brow, because brows were always crinkled when thinking was taking place, and Pooh was almost positive that thinking, or something very much like it, was what he was doing at the moment. Besides, how can you run out of something, Pooh asked slowly, when you don't run, you bounce? Say, responded Tigger admiringly, that's a pretty good question. Yes, I knew it must be, said Pooh proudly, because I certainly don't know the answer to it. What else don't you know, Pooh? Asked Tigger hopefully. Pooh was now much too excited to remember to crinkle his brow. If up means more, well, I'm certain it sometimes does, he began. Sure it does, agreed Tigger. Like stocking up on honey, or dressing up, or growing up. Then Pooh continued, I don't know why bounces, which all go up, should ever end. Should they? No, siree, hooted Tigger joyously, launching himself upward in one tremendous bounce. It was the most amazing bounce ever seen in the 100-acre woods. Pooh had to sit down quickly and lean back until he was flat on the ground to keep his friend in sight. The tallest trees in the forest suddenly felt like tiny saplings again as Tigger sailed up past them, and birds were forced to fly on their backs in order to watch Tigger grow smaller and smaller as he went higher and higher and higher. Clouds were so surprised by Tigger's passage that they thought for a moment they were upside down and Tigger was falling, because no one had ever bounced that high before. After all, it was long past supper time when Tigger finally returned to earth, but Pooh, hungry as he was, knew that waiting for his friend was the polite thing to do. Yippee! Cried Tigger, shaking Pooh's hand so vigorously that Pooh was forced to bounce in excited little circles around with him. You did it again! What exactly was it that I did? Pooh wanted to know. Why, what you always do, Pooh boy, answered Tigger. What you always do. Ah, said Pooh, still not having the slightest idea what it all meant, but taking comfort in how familiar it sounded. Well, you're very welcome. I'll see you tomorrow for breakfast. It's Tuesday, you know, called Tigger, who was hopscotching across the 100-acre wood, bouncing so high that a flock of geese flying south for the winter started to follow him home. The smile faded from Pooh's face. Breakfast, he muttered, thinking of a cupboard full of honey. Tomorrow, Pooh sighed, and grinned a lopsided grin. Oh, bother. Are you sleeping, Pooh? Asked Tigger as he looked deep into Pooh's wide-opened eyes. Why, no, Tigger, Pooh answered. Are you? No, this is what happens when Tiggers do what Tiggers do best, he sighed. We're just too fantastic to be sleepifying. Tigger leaned closer to Pooh. Tell me, Pooh, what do you think when someone mentions vegetables? Before Pooh could answer, a large yawn overcame him. That's all I wanted to know, said Tigger, grabbing Pooh's arm and pulling him quickly along through the forest. Where are we going, Tigger? Gasped Pooh. To find a bedtime story that does the job it's supposed to do, replied Tigger. The next thing Pooh knew, he and Tigger were in Rabbit's kitchen, sitting across the table from Rabbit himself. Bedtime story, Rabbit was saying in surprise. All I know about bedtime stories is that I love to listen to them, but I'm not very good at telling them. Rabbit looked embarrassed. I hardly ever get to the end, you see. Why not? Asked Pooh. I always put myself to sleep, Rabbit admitted. That's just the kind we want to hear, exclaimed Tigger and Pooh at the same time. Very well, Rabbit shrugged. If you insist. Well, that is all of our Winnie the Pooh's bedtime stories for today. But I will be reading you the next story in just a couple of days, Rabbit's Rules of Order. The next story in Winnie the Pooh's bedtime stories. I hope that you enjoyed the story. Have a good evening.